If giving up has ever felt like the only logical choice, this is the video. Not because it's going to shame anyone for quitting, but because what most people call giving up isn't actually what they think it is. Here's the conventional wisdom: people who give up easily are lazy. Undisciplined, they just don't want it badly enough. Society has built an entire self-help industry around that idea: push harder, stay consistent, no days off. And on the surface, it makes sense. But here's what's strange. Some of the most ambitious, intelligent, deeply motivated people in the world are also the ones who quit the most. They start businesses, drop them. Begin creative projects, abandon them. Set goals with genuine excitement, and walk away before anything gets difficult. That's not laziness, that's something else entirely. And there's one question that almost nobody asks, a question that sits underneath all of it, and that this entire video is going to build toward answering. Why does quitting feel like relief, even when it destroys something someone genuinely wanted? That answer will change how anyone thinks about motivation, identity, and self-sabotage. But to get there, it has to start somewhere that might feel completely unrelated. It has to start with the brain's hidden alarm system. Most people assume they quit because they stopped caring. That's almost never what's actually happening. Neuroscientists have a concept called the threat response, a state the brain enters when it perceives danger. And here's the part that's almost never talked about in conversations about motivation. The brain doesn't distinguish between a physical threat and a psychological one. A lion chasing someone through a forest, a creative project that might fail publicly. To the older, more primal parts of the brain, these register in the same category. When the brain enters a threat state, it does something very specific. It narrows focus. It shuts down long-term thinking. It prioritizes escape. And quitting is escape. There's a study from Stanford researcher Carol Dweck, whose work on mindset is well known, but there's a lesser-cited finding buried in her research that's far more revealing. When students who believed their intelligence was fixed were given problems that were too hard, their brain activity didn't just show frustration. It showed patterns nearly identical to threat detection. Their cognitive resources actually withdrew from the problem. They weren't choosing to stop trying. Their brain was protecting them. And the trigger wasn't failure itself, it was the anticipation of what failure would mean about who they were. Think about that for a moment. The quitting happened before the failure. The brain bailed early to avoid a verdict it was terrified of receiving. That's not weakness, that's a survival mechanism misfiring in the wrong environment. But here's where this gets more complicated and honestly more unsettling. Because if the threat response explains when people quit, it doesn't fully explain why some people are so much more sensitive to that trigger than others. Why the same difficult challenge causes one person to dig in and another to disappear. The answer to that lives in something that was built long before anyone was old enough to choose it. There's a psychological concept called a working model of self. It sounds academic, but the idea is almost disturbingly simple. From a very young age, before conscious memory is even fully operational, children begin building a blueprint of what they believe they deserve, what they're capable of, and most critically, what happens when they try and fall short. This blueprint is built from small moments. A parent's reaction to a bad grade, whether effort was praised or achievement, whether failure was treated as information or as identity. And here's the disturbing part. That blueprint doesn't update automatically when someone becomes an adult. There's a pattern that therapists observe so consistently it has its own informal name. They call it pre-emptive quitting. It works like this. Someone starts something new, a fitness journey, a relationship, a business. Early on, things go reasonably well. But somewhere around the point where real commitment is required, where the stakes actually rise, they find a reason to stop. Sometimes it's a rational-sounding excuse. The timing isn't right. The market shifted. They're just not that interested anymore. But in session after session, the same people reveal the same underlying architecture. Somewhere in childhood, they received a message, sometimes explicit, sometimes just absorbed from the atmosphere, that their worth was conditional on performance. And so the working model of self learned a strategy: if I quit before I truly fail, my identity stays protected. It's not laziness, it's armor. The quitting isn't a lack of ambition, it's an extremely sophisticated defense against the pain of finding out that trying your hardest still wasn't enough. That's why willpower advice so often fails people in this pattern. Telling someone to just push through is like telling someone wearing full body armor to move faster. The armor is the problem. The armor feels necessary. So what actually dissolves it? Here's where something unexpected enters the picture, because the research points in a direction most people would never guess. Here's something counterintuitive. The conventional solution for people who give up too easily is usually built around motivation. Find your why, visualize success, create accountability structures, stay inspired. And motivation research does support some of this. But there's a separate body of research, largely from behavioral psychology, that reveals something almost backward. The people who become genuinely persistent aren't the ones who learn to push through discomfort better. They're the ones who learn to make quitting more conscious. Psychologist Peter Gallwitzer spent years studying what he called implementation intentions, essentially the difference between people who set goals and people who actually follow through on them. What he found wasn't about motivation levels. It was about something far more specific. People who follow through had, consciously or not, separated two things that most people merge together. The decision to do something from the moment-to-moment urge to escape it. When the urge to quit arrives, and it always arrives, people without this separation experience it as a signal. A message that this isn't working, that they should stop. People with this separation experience it as noise. Expected noise. They've pre-decided that the urge to quit doesn't carry information about whether to actually quit. What changed wasn't their pain tolerance. It was their relationship to the alarm. And this is where the original question starts coming into focus. Because there's still one piece missing, the piece that ties the threat response, the identity blueprint, and the paradox of completion into a single, coherent answer. Why does quitting feel like relief even when it costs someone something they genuinely wanted? Here's the answer. Quitting feels like relief because neurologically, psychologically, architecturally, it is relief. Not fake relief, not irrational relief. Actual, genuine, physiological relief. The threat response de-escalates. The alarm turns off. The identity blueprint doesn't get tested. The working model of self stays intact, protected, unexamined. Quitting works, that's the problem. It solves the immediate pain perfectly. It just charges the future. And the people who get caught in this cycle aren't broken. They're not undisciplined, they're not lazy. They are, in the most literal sense, doing what their nervous system was trained from years of experience, maybe from childhood, to do when things feel threatening. The exit is practiced. The exit is automatic. The exit feels like intelligence. Here's what changes it though. Not motivation, not discipline, not a better morning routine. What changes it is the moment someone becomes curious about their own pattern instead of ashamed of it. When the question shifts from why can't I stop quitting to what is this protecting me from? That question doesn't just change behavior, it changes the architecture. Because you can't dismantle a defense mechanism you're still pretending you don't have. The brain's alarm system misfires in safe environments. The identity blueprint runs quietly in the background, filtering every decision through a lens that was built for a version of life that no longer exists. And quitting feels like relief because, for a long time, it probably was. But relief and growth rarely live in the same place. And the most powerful moment in anyone's story isn't when they stopped quitting. It's when they got genuinely curious about why they started. If something in this landed, sit with it for a minute before closing the tab. Sometimes a thought that moves something in the chest is worth writing down. Drop it in the comments. The pattern often becomes clearer the moment someone names it out loud.